I would like to welcome you to the Wellesley Centers for Women parallel event for the NGO Forum of the 2018 UN Commission on the Status of Women meetings. We're gathered here tonight for the power of data, how gender-focused research institutes in Africa can support rural women and girls. Since we have a small crowd, I would invite everyone to come up and forward so that we have the opportunity for a more intimate discussion after the event, if you don't mind. I know it always makes the speakers feel good to have the audience nearby. I'm Dr. Layli Maparyan, and I am the Executive Director of the Wellesley Centers for Women, which is the largest and one of the oldest academic women and gender-focused research institutes in the United States, located at Wellesley College, a women's college in the greater Boston area in the United States. And I'm very delighted to actually be realizing an idea that our Wellesley Centers for Women council member, Abigail Burgesson, at the end of the table there, and I concocted a few years back. One of the priorities of the Wellesley Centers for Women is to partner with women and gender-focused research institutes around the world. And in particular, we like to partner with organizations that may either be in emerging economies or developing nations, or ones that are also new and want to partner with a more mature, established research institute such as the Wellesley Centers for Women. We are past our 40th anniversary at this point. We've been doing this work for a long time, and we know the importance of women-oriented organizations working together. We know that the United Nations has placed more information on more emphasis on research and data in recent years, and we want to make sure that we promote the ability of populations all over the world to have research by them, for them, about them that meets their needs. So that's the spirit in which we're presenting today's panel. I would like to mention that we're going to be taping this event for an audio podcast and also for video, and we'll be posting it online later. There's a small card in your seat that gives the information that if you want to look at it or share it with friends later, you'll be able to do that. I'd like to begin by introducing the speakers who will be speaking today. I want to begin, and I'll move from my left, your right, forwards. I'd like to begin by introducing Dorcas Coker-Appiah, who is the Executive Director of the Gender Studies and Human Rights Documentation Center, which is a women's rights advocacy organization based in Accra. And I actually had the opportunity to visit her a few years ago and visit the Gender Center, and I said, I'm going to bring you to a panel because I love your work and it has been so important. It has changed life in your nation, and you're going to hear more about that. She serves on the steering committee of NetRight, a network of women's rights organizations. She's a member of the Federation of Women Lawyers, and she chairs the board of the Pan-African Network, Women in Law and Development in Africa. At the international level, Dorcas is a member of the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the body of experts elected under CEDAW to monitor implementation of the convention by states parties. Also going to introduce next to her, Clementina Baptista Furtado is the director of CEGEF, the Center for Research and Training in Gender and Family at the University of Cabo Verde. Her teaching and research focus on human geography, migration, gender and spatial planning, and also development. At CEGEF, Clementina promotes the social status of women in connection with different actors in government, civil society, and the activist milieu through research, publications, events, and collaborations. And I should mention that one of the collaborations is a collaboration with the Wellesley Centers for Women. We've been working together now for a few years, and she was actually the first partner that we made in terms of our international strategic goals of working with our sister research institutes around the world. And her presentation will be translated into English by Paulo Borges, the director of the English Language Institute and an ESL professor at the University of Cabo Verde, who is seated next to her. After that, I'd like to introduce Tracy Gladstone, who is an associate director and senior research scientist at the Wellesley Centers for Women. She's the inaugural director of the Robert S. and Grace W. Stone Primary Prevention Initiatives, which aims to research, develop, and evaluate programs to prevent the onset of depression and other mental health concerns in children and adolescents. Building on this clinically informed work with at-risk populations, Tracy developed and piloted a cognitive behavioral group intervention for women who are recovering from fistula repair surgery in Ethiopia. And of course, last but not least, as I already mentioned, Abigail Burgesson is a passionate and influential advocate for women's rights with more than 20 years experience working in the nonprofit sector on the African continent with extensive global outreach. Prior to joining the African Women's Development Fund, where she works as Special Programs Manager, Abigail worked in the area of democratic governance and social justice issues with the Institute of Economic Affairs, Africa Leadership Forum, and the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs in Ghana. In 2008, she received the Feminist Leadership in Africa Award from the Akina Mamawa Africa Leadership Institute, and in 2015, she represented CSOs in Ghana at important global convenings. And I think that she and I have officially known each other for more than a decade now, and we have, as feminists often do, plotted to change the world together. So thank you for joining us in today's endeavor.
Okay, thank you, Layli. I do have a PowerPoint presentation, and I hope it will work. But if it won't, I'll pass it on to Donna to do to press it for me. Well, as you heard, my organization is called the Gender Studies and Human Rights Documentation Center. And when we set up the organization in 1995, one of our objectives for setting it up was to set up an organization that would use data to be able to push for women's agenda. So in 1998, we started off by undertaking a national research on violence against women and girls in the country. At the time, violence was an unseen issue. It was seen as something that was private and nobody should talk about it. So that was the biggest challenge. How do we ensure that we knew anecdotally that this was a problem, but we didn't have any data to confirm what we knew? So that's what led us to undertake the research. In doing the research, we were a small organization. At the time, there were literally 5 of us in the organization. But this was a national event that we wanted to take up. So we partnered with 8 organizations, which were both national level organizations and community-based organizations. And by so doing, our intention was that we would then put the issue of violence against women as a public agenda. And one of the objectives was also to challenge the social tolerance and complicity, as well as the state's silence on the issue of violence against women. In addition to our partners, which were the okay, do it from there. I'll tell you what. In addition to our project partners, we also worked with some academics from our universities, who led us in the field work, data analysis, and writing of the report. As I said, we were a small organization. We knew what was missing. But to give credibility to our work, we thought that it would be important to work with academics so that, our work will be, the output will get the credibility that it deserved. So it took us a whole year to do the field work. We did a number of, we did three. First, we did the qualitative, so focus group discussions in the communities that we work with. We did in-depth interviews before we did, then based on the information we gathered from this, then we did a quantitative survey. The findings revealed, and I don't want to go into what we found in terms of the prevalence and so on and so forth, because there isn't much time, but I can only say that what came out in terms of prevalence was similar to what was recorded elsewhere. At least a third of the women that we interviewed had experienced violence at the hands of a partner in their, in their lives. So that was it. We found the different types of violence: physical, sexual, psychological, economic, and even for our context, traditional and cultural abuse was also highly identified. But in terms of the findings, it revealed that violence against women and children was not seen as a crime, but was viewed as a private matter that should be taken care of within the family. And because of this, when anybody tried to intervene, it was seen as an intrusion into a private affair. I mean, this is so similar to what previously, even in the developed countries, violence against women was seen, so it was not considered a human rights affair, it was a private family affair. And in 1998, we still had that problem in our country. And so because of this societal view, it inhibited women in talking about the experience of violence when it did happen. And that's because of that, when women chose to talk about their experiences of violence, the study indicated that they preferred to report informally to family, friends, or members of the community. Therefore, it meant, in terms of using the state structures, reporting was very low. And that's when they did report, the state agency or the police was the least likely venue for them to report. And this was also influenced by the attitude of those state agency personnel that women came into contact with, who had the same biases as the society in which they operate. And this tended to reflect in how they responded to cases of violence. So a woman would go, and the first question that, what did you do to get beaten? Or if it was a case of rape, what were you doing at that time, or then what were you wearing? So all these biases tended to affect the way they responded to women. And that's when we found also that there was a lack of support for victims of violence when they did report. And whilst this lack of support was evident throughout the country, it was more so in the rural communities. And when you talk about the rural community, accessibility to even the state institutions was a problem, because not all communities had police stations where they could report. They may not have hospitals also, so they had a peculiar problem when it came to reporting. So they did not have the kind of support that a victim required to be able to either access justice or psychosocial services. So based on the findings, we identified 4 priority issues that we thought needed to be addressed. And the first one was obviously to address the poor state institutional response to VOW, which led to frequent patterns of victim blaming, referring reported cases back to the family, and the way the state agency personnel and society in general trivialized the issue of violence against women and girls. And then also one of the areas that we looked at was the high degree of tolerance of violence against women in the Ghanaian society, which was perpetuated by the strong perceptions that domestic violence, that is violence that occurs in the home in intimate relationships, is a private family matter and not a serious crime, as we found. So that was another area. And then there was also the general confusion about what constitutes violence and ignorance about the causes, consequences, and mechanisms. And then, of course, the issue of the isolation of rural women and women's expressed dissatisfaction at the assistance they received. So based on this, we developed some activities to respond to our priority issues. And one of the first things that we did was to develop a rural response system that was aimed at, responding or supporting women to access services. We also focus on training of state agency personnel to change some of the biases and attitudes so that they could respond effectively to victims. We also brought in the training of other civil society organizations on violence against women, because at the time, not many people knew, or not many organizations were working on that area. So we thought that it was to be able to expand the work around it, we needed to bring on board other people. And then finally, we found that we needed a strong law, a comprehensive law that will address all the issues around violence. So with all of these activities, the rural response system, I think I'll focus on that because this was what was targeted at the rural population. We sought to increase, the objectives was to increase the visibility of violence against women as a social issue in the target communities and surrounding areas. We established a community-based response team, we called them Combat, to support and protect women experiencing violence. Time is flying quickly. And these combat members were community men and women that we trained to provide the support and protect the women. I can say that, because time is, so the role of the combat was to sensitize and raise awareness of how to support women in crisis intervention, provide counseling to their victims, and the fact that when women sought outside help, they did not necessarily know what they wanted, so they needed somebody to support them. What I would say, the presentation, I think is available for everybody. I just want to conclude by saying the impact of the data that we had. And one of the key things that came out of it is that because of that, we were able to make violence against women in our country a social justice issue. A number of organizations started working around it. Then we were able to use the data to push for the passage of a comprehensive domestic violence law. And I'm always saying that when the first draft was put out by the then Attorney General, what he said was that with the evidence, with the data from the Gender Center study, there was no doubt that we had a problem on our hands and we needed to address it. It took us 6 years to get the bill passed, but eventually we got a very good bill. Implementation has been a little challenge, but at least with the law, we can always say that this is the law. We can hold, states, we can hold institutions accountable to ensure that they go by what the law says. And finally, I think that one of the things I would like to put out there is, because of our partnership, our collaboration with some academics, it also brought them into the activist fold. And now there are some of them are then, seeing the need to collaborate with civil society organizations in doing the research, because they will do the research sitting in there, but it does not get translated into implementation, or it doesn't become useful for the ordinary person. And so this kind of collaboration we found has been very useful, and I think that Wellesley collaborating with not only other academic institutions, but I think that collaborating with other civil society will make their research findings most beneficial to the people who need it. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we will turn it over to Clementina and Paolo.
Okay, thank you. Hello everyone. A minha série para apresentar um bocadinho, dizemos sobre os equipes que aqui está fazendo para combater a pobreza na saúde de mulheres rurais com deficiência.
Hold on one second. I want you to have your own microphone. Can you pass this one so that you have a microphone?
Sure.
That would be better. People may hear it in both languages.
Yeah.
She said that she's here to talk a little bit about problems with women in the rural areas, and as well as with the people with disabilities.
No mesmo país pequenote, que tem pouco mais de 500 mil de habitantes, até 2014, mas eu era mulher, mas a partir de 2015, homens são a maioria.
We came from a very small island nation that has a very small population. Until 2014, we only had 500,000 people, and we had more women than men. That's what the statistics said.
E nossa estatística está mostrando uma mulher na meio rural realmente está em situação de desvantagem. Por exemplo, dados sobre taxa de atividade está mostrando uma na meio rural mulheres têm valor inferior, quer a homens rurais, quer a homens urbanos, quer as mulheres urbanas e quer a média nacional.
So if you look at the statistics, you can clearly see that women in the rural areas are suffering because they are. There is a lot of disadvantages that are against them. If you look at the statistics, if you compare these women both to women from the urban areas and to men from the rural areas and men from the urban areas, you can clearly see that women are suffering more than men, and they're having more disadvantages.
Mesmo que os órgãos não estão falando na pobreza, não tem 35% da população pobre e 10% da população que é muito pobre, sendo que no Podoema, na zona rural, mulheres é 4 vezes mais do que áreas urbanas, e é sobretudo mulheres.
So if you also look at the table, you can see that so we have 35% of our population is poor, and women in the rural areas are 3 times poorer than both men and
Corrige. Na área rural é mais extrema pobreza 4 vezes mais que urbana, sendo que mulheres são mais pobres.
In the rural areas, she's saying that women are 4 times poorer than women from the urban areas.
Também no hoje uma hora que analisa e acesso à escolarização, no hoje mulheres nas áreas rurais é que têm escolaridade mais baixa.
So when we analyze the school level, the data also tells us that women from the rural areas are the ones who have the lower school level.
Mesmo que não analisa que no hoje de uma forma geral na Cabo Verde, mulheres estão mais no ensino, tem mais mulheres com ensino superior do que homens. Na meio rural é apenas 3%, 3,5%.
Although on national level, women study more than men. However, in the rural areas, only 3% of women
Ensino superior.
have their education to go to school.
E em relação ao perfil de pobreza, não pode olhar, mas na população, uma mulher que em termos de população muito pobre, que se amastou, 54% de população muito pobre é mulher.
If we pay attention to the poverty profile, we can see that women from the rural areas are the ones who are going through more issues because 54% of women in the rural areas are poor.
E 68% está na área rural.
And this total
68% de pessoas muito pobres está na área rural.
and 68% of the total poor population live in the rural areas
Na ilha de Santiago.
on the island of Santiago.
Também o que não está hoje é assim, mas comparando Cabo Verde a nível de rural e urbano, a área rural, de uma forma geral, é aquele que se apresenta a população mais pobre, mais teu.
So in Cabo Verde, if we compare the rural people from the rural area and the urban area, we can clearly see that people from the rural area are poorer than people from the urban areas.
No entanto, horas que não está de olho, é esse que é mais teu que representa explorações agrícolas. Mesmo que é carbono, né? Mais teu esse que representa explorações agrícolas. Mulheres.
So say that the majority of women who live in the rural areas, they are only doing the works like farming and
Eles são mais teu que homem.
and they are more than men.
Okay. E dados estão mostrando, por exemplo, na área rural, pessoas que vivem com menos dinheiro do que homens por dia. Uma média de $2,50 na área urbana e $2 na área rural.
So women in the rural area only makes $2. Sabe $2 e meio na área urbana?
Urbana é mais teu.
So women in the urban areas make more money than women in the rural areas. So women in the rural areas, they make about $2 a day.
Então, aquelas estatísticas ali estão mostrando ele é importante para nós. Estatísticas de desagregado por cento estão mostrando onde que estão as meninas e mulheres e mora que não está e atinge nossos objetivos. Toma medida para não atingir nossos objetivos, sobretudo com meninas nas áreas rurais.
So these statistics is extremely important because it helps us understand the problem, but the fact that it's data disaggregated by sex, it helps us understand better how women in the rural areas are affected by poverty, and it will help us take effective measurements to change.
E se não mantém que estatística ao longo do tempo, não está conseguindo fazer comparação que está permitindo, por exemplo, reduzir a pobreza.
So if we continue to conduct studies and get all these statistics, it will help us resolve problems. But we have to continue to do it and compare all the data so we can take effective measurements.
Especialmente na casa de estudo sobre o uso do tempo, que eu apresentava ali há 2 anos atrás, dados estão mostrando exatamente o modo que as meninas que estão fazendo mais seu trabalho não remunerado, que ela está afetada principalmente na possibilidade que eles têm de ir para a escola.
So because women spend a lot of time doing unpaid work, that makes it difficult for them to get education. And 2 years ago, she was presenting about the use of time, like how women use their time.
No trabalho não paga. Mas essa fase cedo, quer dizer, 2 vezes mais trabalho não remunerado que homem.
So women do unpaid work twice as much as men. So they do way more unpaid work than men.
E grande parte desse tempo é dedicado para cuidar de crianças e de pessoas idosas, pessoas com deficiência.
So they spend most of their time taking care of their children, other people, and they also take care of the people with disabilities.
E não constatam aquele que tem sido causa de grande vulnerabilidade, como nunca tem creche, por exemplo, para dar resposta àquelas pessoas, sobretudo de campo, mulheres de campo, que olha que essa que tem direito feminino que vai fazer esse trabalho.
We have understood that this is a serious problem because they don't have time to do paid work, And in addition to that, there are no caring centers in the rural areas where they can leave their children so that they can work.
E esse foi hoje naquele quadro que não tem ali, mas na 2014 não tinha aquela situação de quase 100% de crianças de 0 a 2 anos que tinha cobertura de creche.
So if you look at that table, you can see that by 2014, all of the children from rural areas, they did not happen to go to caring center.
É global, mas
Really
tudo,
global?
sim.
So this is referring to both urban area and rural
Mas a
area.
situação
So
é
there
mais
is no
crítica.
caring center.
A situação é mais crítica no meio rural.
But the
Como qualquer
situation,
alternativa.
but the situation is more critical in the rural areas because they have no alternative.
Como no meio urbano, é sempre vários que te oferecem.
Because in the urban areas there are some private institutions that offer this type of service.
Então, que o resultado que a estatística ali não constata, mas realmente prioridade para crianças de 0 aos 3 anos.
So having conducted this study, they have reached the conclusion that the priority will be, they should prioritize the children from the age of 0 to 3.
Amor, ou esse tinha que ficar na casa para se cuidar de menino, ou então esse tinha que tinha dupla ou tripla jornada de trabalho.
So they would, the women would either have to stay at home taking care of the children, or they would have to do triple jobs.
Então, por isso foi criado aquele grupo interministerial.
That's why they have created an interministerial group
Que propõe Plano Nacional de Cuidados.
that has proposed a national caring plan,
Que já está aprovado.
which has already been approved or passed.
E no dia 21, ele estava tendo socialização do Sistema Nacional de Cuidados.
And on March 21st, they will be socializing this particular plan.
E aquele plano é exatamente para poder trazer medidas concretas do governo no sentido de corresponsabilizar o governo assume crianças do 0 aos 4 anos que sabem incluído no sistema e liberta aquelas mulheres, sobretudo rural, de que essa tarefa das oportunidades de ter acesso ao mercado de trabalho.
This plan is actually going to help resolve the problem in the rural areas because it's going to force the government to create and take that responsibility of creating centers where they can place their children so that they can do paid work.
E na base de que ele surge uma coisa importante que é a qualificação nacional de 2 novas profissões.
Because of this plan, they have also created training courses for women and people, both women and men who will be taking care of the children.
Que é cuidadores de infância e de pessoas dependentes, idosas e coisas.
So these people will be trained to take care of both of the children as well as the elderly people and people with disabilities.
Ou seja, o que não estava tendo mais e mulher do meio rural, estava tendo mais disponibilidade, não só de a começar para a escola, mas também eles próprios acabam para ser qualificados para desempenhar determinadas profissões que estão qualificados.
So this plan will also help women to do paid work because they will not be taking care of the children. And they will also have opportunity of being trained so that they can do this type of work.
E nós não achamos ganho no meio urbano é grande, mas no meio rural é maior ainda para morar. No meio urbano, apesar de que o Estado que tinha assumido e tinha alternativa. No meio urbano, no meio rural, que tinha nenhuma alternativa, nem público nem privado. E nesse momento, com a assunção de que a coisa vai ter que ir lá.
So, so in the rural areas, we have, and the problem is way more serious. Because in the urban areas, they had some private institutions that would take care of the children, but in the rural areas, they didn't have it.
Em relação a mulheres e meninas com deficiência, não faz um estudo sobre acesso a cuidados de saúde sexual e reprodutiva em 2017.
In regards to women with disabilities, they conduct a study in 2017.
E realmente não constata, mas tem falta de decisão profissional, mas é discriminado, mas reclama um atendimento humanizado.
So these women, they concluded that there is lack of professional secrecy. There is they have a lot of problems.
E sobre
Can we do some example?
e se existiam discriminados
And they are discriminated. I mean, people discriminate against them.
e sobretudo nunca pode ser situação.
And we still need to conduct a lot of studies so we can understand the problems.
Por isso, exato-nos também arranca um estudo sobre a situação socioeconômica de que as mulheres ali em parceria com a PIMUR e com a Associação de Mulheres e Meninas com
That's
Deficiência.
why they're going to conduct another study this year to understand this problem in a more in-depth way.
E tudo que é o penúltimo slide, nossos parceiros.
So the last slide, these are our partners.
E que é o último logo é logo do Sistema Nacional de Piragem que nos estava lá, que é grande orgulho para nós.
And the logo at the bottom, that's going to be the logo for the national carry plan.
Yeah. Obrigada.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, now down to Tracy Gladstone.
Okay. So I'm going to talk this evening about my work I've been doing in the past few years to support women and girls in Ethiopia who suffer from obstetric fistula. So I'm going to describe this work to you, and then I'm going to really try to focus on ways that I've used data to guide the work I'm doing, and really the importance of using data and evidence-based programs to really make the best use out of limited resources to promote positive social change in Africa. Would you want to change for me?
Yes,
Is that-
actually.
Okay. So I'm going to just skip this slide. Okay, so what is obstetric fistula? Obstetric fistula is a serious obstetrical complication. It really is relatively non-existent in industrialized countries, but it happens with some frequency in lower resource countries where women do not have access to medical support and medical care during childbirth. It affects about 50 to 100,000 women per year. And across the globe, 2 to 3.5 million women suffer from this problem. So when a woman develops this problem, almost always she loses her child. The baby dies in childbirth, and she's left with a physical problem that makes her unable to control her bodily wastes. So she becomes really something of she sometimes is left out of community activities. She's not able to work anymore. Often husbands will leave women. About 70% of women with this problem do not have a live child. So really, a lot of times these women are isolated from their communities. They can't participate in community events. And there are actually very effective medical treatments for this problem, and women who do get these surgical treatments often do well. But really nobody seems to be attending much to the psychological consequences of obstetric fistula. So my work as a psychologist that focuses on depression prevention and on developing interventions to support at-risk populations have been trying to develop and pilot a program that really can attend to the psychological effects of this very difficult problem. So the work I've been doing has been focused in Ethiopia, and I just put up a little slide about it. I work primarily in the northern region, the Amhara region of Ethiopia, and in the city of Gondar, and there's a fistula center there at which I've worked. Before I started to do this work, this is just because it's just a sense of how data can be supporting this kind of work. I really spent some time trying to get a sense of what life was like for women in Ethiopia and in rural Ethiopia. And so we just did a little bit of anthropological, just a little literature searching of some of the anthropological literature to get a sense of what it's like to be a woman in rural Ethiopia. And many women are, girls really are married quite young, as teenagers. And the husband is often the legal head of the family, and having children is extremely important to many rural women in Ethiopia. And a lot of these women are much less well educated than men are. So my goal was to develop and pilot test a depression prevention program that would target women who had been brought for treatment for obstetric fistula and were getting surgical treatment, but nobody was attending to their psychological So my goal was to develop a program that could be adapted from existing evidence-based depression prevention programs that would be able to be integrated into the existing healthcare system, that would be acceptable to stakeholders, that would be accessible and culturally relevant to this population, and that could be developed with the collaboration of local partners. So certainly, living in America as a woman with white privilege, I really needed to rely on my partners to help me to develop a program that would meet the needs as they were perceived by the community I was working in. So I really, I want to talk a minute about my partners, because my partners were just tremendously important, and really this work could not have happened without very solid and committed partners. I started by collaborating with the Fistula Foundation, which is out of San Jose, California, and they are involved actually really in promoting medical treatment of this problem. So they have built fistula centers throughout Africa and parts of Asia. They've trained surgeons to conduct fistula repair surgeries, but they have not focused at all on the mental health aspects of this problem. But I had partners there, and they connected me with Women in Health Alliance International, which is an NGO out of Paris, and again focused very much on the medical problems associated with fistula, but people at WAHA were quite interested in also addressing the psychological effects of this problem. And Dr. Muli Mulera is a renowned fistula surgeon. At the time, she was the country director for WAHA Ethiopia, and she was a partner of mine. I also partnered with an anthropologist out of Brandeis University who has done qualitative research on women in the Amhara region that are struggling with obstetric fistula, and with a gynecologist who has done fistula repair surgery. So really it was a project that involved many, many people. I really viewed myself as a student throughout this process of developing this program and really finding out the best way to address the needs of this population and help give them some strategies and some skills so that they can manage the trauma that really is associated with this very difficult medical problem. So the project that I was involved in involved 3 stages. The first was to conduct qualitative interviews with stakeholders, and by stakeholders I mean the doctors and the nurses in the hospital. The second stage was to conduct qualitative interviews with women who were themselves suffering from obstetric fistula, and then the third stage was to develop and pilot an intervention that might target the really the needs that were identified through these qualitative interviews. So I'm just going to run through stage 1 and stage 2. You have them in your packets, and Donna can just pop them up there. But when by stakeholders, I mean doctors and nurses who are working with these women every day. And on the next slide, Donna, it just gives you a sense of what some of the things are that what some of the answers we got to our questions were. So really what this shows you is that the physicians there and the nurses recognize the problem of depression and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder that affected these women, and really the fact that nobody there had the skills to manage these issues. So people recognize, the doctors and the nurses working with the women every day recognize that these were issues, but didn't really know, didn't have skills, didn't have the strategies, didn't know what to do to support the women. They really just focused on their physical needs and not their psychological needs. We also met with the women themselves to get a sense from them of how they coped with their fistula, how they managed with family and friends, and what they thought they needed, and if they would be receptive to an intervention that would really help them build some skills to feel better. And then based on the data that we got from those interviews, we adapted an evidence-based depression prevention program for use with this population. So we used the information we had, for example, about the importance of religion and social support, about the possible role that nurses might be able to play in conducting this intervention. So we used the information that we had from the literature and from these interviews and from collaborations with partners to develop a program. The goal of which was to train nurses to work with women in groups in the hospital and help them develop the skills they would need to be better able to return to their communities post-surgery and avoid depression. So I told I only have a few more minutes, so I'm just going to run through a little bit. So we went back to Ethiopia. We trained a group of 5 nurses who were nurses on the fistula ward to conduct a group-based intervention. And I just want to give you a sense of some of the data that we have. So when the nurses conducted the intervention, after we trained the nurses, they conducted the interventions with women, 5 separate groups of women, and we provided supervision via Skype. So after each session, I was able to Skype with the nurse that was conducting the session, with the translator there, and able to give some guidance to make sure that she was actually using the program the way it was intended to be used. So I'm going to give you some of the data that we have very quickly, and we use both. This gives you a sense of some of the standard measures we used. So the measures that we use have previously been used successfully with rural populations in Ethiopia. They had already been translated into Amharic. And so we used the self-reporting questionnaire, which is just a quick measure of depressive symptoms over the past month. And then we used the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire, which is a measure of symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, over the past week. We also had some group leader forms and some forms for the women themselves. They were all interview administered, so nurses helped us to administer the forms, but really to get a sense of the leaders and the women's experience with the groups itself. And I just want to give you a sense of the next one. Okay, so this gives you a sense of the groups. So we ran 5 groups. Each nurse ran a group herself, and this gives you a sense of the age of the women. They were on average about in their mid-20s. They had on average struggled with fistula for about 4 years, a little bit longer than 4 years. And if you look at the next slide, this gives you a sense of our outcome data, and I'll just summarize it for you. But basically what we found was that, so we administered, our baseline period of time was just after the surgery. So the women had surgery, and then they completed our forms to give us a sense of what their symptoms were of depression and PTSD post-surgery. Then we re-administered the measures 2 weeks later after the group had occurred, and then they came back to the hospital 3 months later to provide follow-up data. And we did have almost, we had over 88% of the women come back for follow-up at 3 months, which was really very exciting for us. And so what this overall shows you is that, can you back?
I'll go back.
Sorry. Yeah, this one. So what this overall showing you is that from baseline to just after the intervention, the average scores for depressive symptoms fell significantly. So women came in, even though they had had surgery and were told that this is going to change their lives and turn their lives around, they still exhibited elevated symptoms of depression just post-surgery. But then after our group, there had been a significant drop in the symptoms of depression, and 3 months later, they had dropped even further. And the other thing we found was that symptoms of PTSD dropped from post-surgery till after our group, and then stayed at that same level. So we did show significant drop in symptoms. We also showed, and I can change it on, thank you. We also showed that the group leaders really liked to run the group. They rated it very highly. They rated the understanding of the women very positively. And we also found that the women themselves, the next one, sorry, that the women themselves really liked the groups. They liked participating in the groups. In fact, there was a story where one of the women was actually ill one day and couldn't come to the room where they held the groups, and so the group moved to her bedside because she really didn't want to miss the group. So the nurses really enjoyed doing it. The women really enjoyed participating in it. The women reported that they used the skills, the next one, Donna, that they used the skills 3 to 4 days per week. So they really were using the skills we taught them. So we taught them a bunch of different activity scheduling and how to problem solve, and they used the skills that we taught them several times a week over the course of the 3-month follow-up. So they rated it very highly. They really thought that other women should be exposed to it. The nurses said they really liked doing it and they wanted to do it more. So it's very positively received. Then I want to go keep going. So in the future, so what I'm working on now is to get funding to take this to the next step. So we had a really positive open trial, and that means that everybody who, all of the women got the group. But what we don't know is how helpful this group was above and beyond the surgery itself. So again, a need for data. What we really need to do is to run groups against usual care. We need to give some women a group, and then some women hold off and give them the group later, but hold off giving them the group. and then see if the women who get the group are actually doing better, if the group is really helping them to manage symptoms of depression and manage symptoms of PTSD as they reintegrate into their communities. Stop there.
So Abigail will be our discussant.
Yeah, I'm the odd one. I'm here as a funder, and it's also a privilege to have a grantee partner, in the person of Dr. Coker-Appiah, who happens to be a grantee of AWDF. So for the 6 years that the legislation was going on, for the campaign to have the domestic violence law was going on, we stood by them and we were funding the coalition, basically because we are women and we're from Africa and we understand the issue. But to start the presentation, I think this is a great opportunity for us because we don't have our own resources. We are an Africa-wide or Pan-African Women's Fund that funds women's rights organizations across Africa along different thematic areas. And we have the opportunity of revising the thematic areas every 5 years when we have to go through a new strategic plan. And this last one, we had to actually tap into data on various issues in Africa to come up with the key areas we needed to fund. What will health and reproductive rights look like in the next 5 to 10 years? What would leadership and governance and peace look like for African women in the next 5 to 10 years? And then also look at issues of economic security and justice. So looking at the present informed us about the future. We had to go to the future scenarios, and we couldn't have done it without data gathered from larger institutions and from our grantee partners across the world. The African Women's Development Fund funds in 40, has a mandate for the entire continent, but currently we are in 43 African countries. And last year, we started funding in the Middle East as well. So we have a few organizations there. And we have over 1,300 grantee partners. Over 80% of them are small to medium-sized organizations, which means they are basically rural organizations. Over 90% of our beneficiaries are rural communities. And you can't talk about funding, being an African fund and funding in Africa if you do not pay attention to rural women and girls. I mean, they form the bulk of the population on the continent. So AWDF itself is actually wired to rural women and girls by default. You know, that is how we were created, and that is how we've assisted. In the past, to reach a grantee in certain parts of Africa, I've got to make a call somewhere, and they have to wait for a market day for the person to come to town before they communicate with the grantee partner. But thanks to cell phones now, we can address some of these. And data has become critical to funders, not just African Women's Development Fund. Before we even start, no matter how small the organization is and where they are based, and that's our niche, we are able to reach a wide number of African women in remote parts of the continent where a lot of our donors cannot get to. And that is why they fund us to do the work. We even have to rely on baseline data. What is the situation as it is now? Because we don't have our own resources. We've got to report back to the donor to let them know the shifts that have taken place, be it in policy, be it in practice, be it in legislations and different things. So data is critical to us, and data enables you to make a stronger case. You can make the case by anecdotal facts and other things, but then when you're able to draw down the figures in terms of, for South Africa at a point had some data around violence against women, sexual violence against women, and it was like every 3 hours, 8 women are raped or killed. You know, you can talk about these things generically, but when you have the figures and then they can bring the people and let you see them, it wakes you up as a donor. It startles a community and a nation. And over the years, I remember long ago, AWDF was funding the Nairobi Women's Hospital, the only women's hospital in Kenya at the time. that was handling a lot of issues along violence against women. And in one of the applications, they requested for funding to develop a software to enable them record the issues of violence against women that comes to their attention. We as a women's fund, an African women's fund, this is key to us. But for other international partners, they needed to justify why they needed all that. Don't you carry the news in the papers and all that? Now, it was as a result of putting in place that software that actually woke the government up as to the reality at hand, how many cases they have. And for the rural women, they have to be rushed to Nairobi because you don't want to lose evidence of the rape case if it's rape. You don't want to have the issue of raising money to have the test done, which also applies to Ghana. The victim and their family must look for funding to pay before they have a doctor see them. But with this kind of facility, it's all covered by the funding the hospital raises. So they quickly had to put all these things in place. And this actually did not only go to the benefit of the hospital, but it also shaped thinking and practice of how issues around violence against women are handled or seen within the continent. And Dr. Coker-Appiah mentioned that it's a silent issue. It is not real until this information started coming up. And then over the years, I heard people say there's a lot of rape going on, violence against women, at home domestic violence. It was also as a result of the data produced and the interventions put in place. People started reporting, felt confident. Like her organization had rural projects, and they also trained with their sister organization, Wilder. They even had paralegals within their communities that were trained to take the cases. So these cases were coming to light, and it was thought that the issues were increasing. But I think we were now hearing more about these kind of abuses. We also have in Nigeria, I've talked about Ghana, we have Kenya, Nigeria. Data also helped a lot in them putting in place things to address issues of violence against women. It doesn't mean that it's been kept, but at least the rescue points and the interventions in terms of shelters and other things that emerged, particularly instituted by women's rights organizations. And the state started putting in place these same interventions. So this is the kind of replicating influence that once you are able to bring out the data, that speaks truth to power in terms of what really exists. We are not making it up. You can see the victims, and these are the issues. And a lot is ignored. Issues of maternal mortality is very high on the continent. It took women's rights organizations producing data, actually disguising themselves, including nurses who were activists and thinking, helping our grantees gather data, because the national statistics did not come out clearly with the facts. But these organizations actually started recording the causes of it, how often backside abortion, backstreet abortions, leading to deaths of women during that, the facilities available, that is access, delays, a whole lot of issues. So with this intervention, we as a donor actually feel convinced, even without this, I must say, as an African fund, we know what pertains there. But because we have to go out to raise resources, we make a stronger case, convincing, compelling cases that actually, when donors decide to move it into verify, they can attest to it. I was involved with an organization, this is a side story, that told me that the donor was happy with the data they produced and the findings of their research, and until they saw the budget of some of the things they had listed for funding. And the donor said, no, we cannot fund this kind of thing, including even insurance for the staff that would work in those places. And the donor was like, do you pay insurance for your staff for being in the field? They said, no, they had to gather the data, and now we want to put in the intervention. So they decided to visit one project site with the donor. Before they got to the first site, the donor changed his mind. and just tick everything that we are going to go along with that. You know, there are times we come round and we tell the stories, but it's like you're making a case. And I personally, I don't like it when organizations come and say, I'm working in the poorest of the poorest communities, you know. I'm working with the poorest of the poor, we are so deprived and everything. It is good, we know. I know that a number of school girls, girls of school going age in Africa who are still not going to school. Although donors have put up school buildings and all the facilities. And I said, now we've got to get to the stage where we put in, we have the issues addressed. Why don't they go to school? You haven't dealt with the issues of tradition and custom. The issue of land and property rights, if it has to do with economic security. Women are farming everywhere in Africa. The population of women farmers on the continent is far higher than anywhere else. Yet they don't own the land. And we have all these data. And we think we are liberating women by doing little bits and pieces. Until these things are addressed, you cannot make a case. So research comes in early, and for the African Women's Development Fund, before, and like most of our partner organizations, data actually came with monitoring and evaluation bits, but now it is critical from the beginning. What is the case that you are making? Can you substantiate the case with data? What exists? What is the picture like? And the figures speak a lot. And then the next level is when you have given the grant to the partner, and then they've got to report back. They've got to use that data gathered at the initial stages, and then the final data during the evaluation to indicate the shift. That is what makes a donor feel that I can invest in this project. You know, because it's getting funding is getting very difficult. It is, people talk about the closing spaces of civil society. Part of it mainly where women's rights issues are concerned has to do with funding. They're like, we are not seeing the change. We invested so much in skills acquisition for people to get this, and we are not seeing it. People think you can change lives with a token of some little money, but you don't believe the research must keep on going. You need to invest more, have multi-year funding, have projects to evolve and grow. I mean, it's an organic phase, and data is what is convincing donors. To conclude, I would say that a lot of the funders, the big funders who give money, big money, are focusing on data now, and they don't really care where you are located in the world. Whether you're a rural organization or whatever, you've got to figure out how you provide that information. And therefore, we're also working with our grantees to build that capacity. They don't really have it, they can deliver. So the issue at hand is, how do we build the capacity of the people we want to support to enable them see the value of getting data and what the data means for future support and for them achieving their goal of transforming the lives of rural women and girls.
Thank you. So before we open the floor for questions and comments, I just want to make a few concluding remarks, bringing it back to the theme of this session, the power of data. You know, at the Wellesley Centers for Women, one of our taglines is shaping a better world through research and action. And all of these presenters have illustrated that very thing. The idea that movements for social change and even direct service efforts that benefit women and girls require our ability to measure the change. And what has really changed, I mean, it's not new anymore that data is needed, but this idea that you have to carefully plan the data collection process prior to the beginning of the work and not just at the ending stage is now widely accepted. And women and gender-focused research institutes make ideal partners for that process because they have people who are trained in the formal methods of data collection, and it makes it a more robust process. But not only do they bring the data collection and analysis expertise, but they also bring the feminist and womanist perspectives that help in the interpretation of the data and the creation of meaning that then can translate into action that really influences women's and girls' lives in substantive ways by shaping policy, by shaping funding, by shaping practices, by shaping advocacy and activism. All of these things are affected by well-executed studies. So I hope you've had an opportunity to learn about the work of some places that you may not have known about before, or at least gained a deeper understanding of the power of data to make change for women and girls. So I'll now open the floor to comments or questions. Since we have a very small audience, I'd actually love to hear what brought you here and what some of your takeaways are, if you're willing to share. Yes.
Hi, I'm Layli. I work for Women's Deliver, which is a global advocacy organization focused on gender equality and the health rights and well-being of women and girls. And my question is actually related to something you said and also said by the last panelist about discrepancies with data and also the collection of data, not only at the end, but also at the beginning, also throughout the process, I think, is something that also needs to happen. How do you hold governments accountable for that, for having accurate data, because a lot of governments don't have the best data around. Yeah. And also, how do you hold government accountable to ensuring that it's connected to a more like a global agenda such as the SDGs when they create these data collections and also these like development programs?
Well, I'll comment on that, and then I'll turn it over to Abigail, whoever else wants to answer. But actually, my answer starts with a story about my first trip to the CSW. When I came for the very first time, and I sat and listened to 2 days of country reports from all of the reports that gave up by the variability in the detail and the quality of the data that was presented by different countries. And it really reflected a few factors that are important. One was the degree to which the countries had good research apparatus in-house, and the other was the agenda of the governments. And obviously we know that having good civil society research apparatus in addition to government research apparatus is important. Some countries were strictly government data oriented. Some were also making their reports against the backdrop of either competing or affirmative civil society research reports. And so one of the things that makes governments accountable is having alternative research resources in country that can affirm or challenge the data that the government presents, or alternately work collaboratively to provide the best possible data, because obviously countries have a vested interest in how they look on their gender issues, and they decide what kind of questions to ask and what kind of questions not to ask. When they set up the response categories for questions, they decide which responses they want to include and which responses they don't want to include. And that influences how they look to the international community, and it also influences what kind of actions can be taken to benefit women or girls based on that data. So there's so many factors to consider, and one of the reasons that we made it a strategic priority of the Wellesley Centers for Women to collaborate with other countries was because we recognized that we could help contribute especially to the development of the civil society research resources, since that's the sector where we do our work here in the United States. And so I completely agree with the spirit of your question that we need to develop robust research resources in every country, and I would even go so far as to argue that good research apparatus is a human right of populations. So that's something that we care deeply about and that we have worked on. And by presenting here, we are trying to really affect the culture around those questions.
She answered partly. We need to develop or work with alternative research institutions. I mean, if we didn't have the Gender and Documentation Center, I don't think it was on government's agenda to do anything about violence against women. Neither is it on the agenda to gather data on maternal health or other related issues. So we need to support institutions like that to gather the information. And then also, we need to make sure that our civil society organizations are strong to hold government accountable. They should be bold enough to say, no, this is the true picture. This is what we need to move forward as a country. And one good thing that is emerging over the continent is this issue of data gathering to change perception, behavior, attitude, policies, and other bit. And an organization like ours would fund someone who came and said, all I need to do is to get this research done, because documentation is also very critical for Africa. I mean, especially where women's rights issues are concerned. And it is important for us to have all this and actually look for organizations that are not aligned. And the poorer a country is and the unstable nature of the country all impacts on their work with data or research. I mean, it becomes the least on the agenda, you know, until you have a powerful organization that can challenge government. So the onus is on us to ensure that government has certain things outlined at the beginning of its term or by the beginning of the year, so that women's rights organizations can actually be part of it. And then we also need to be part of the process. You know, we cannot work on our own and then leave government to work on its own. We should be willing to be part of panels, committees, and other things that can really shape the thinking and the approach, because a whole lot of things are ignored when they've got to design a program to meet the needs of women.
If I may just add, you know, you asked about how do we hold governments accountable, and increasingly now there's a requirement that states collect data, but they do it through the statistical services, which is so they do more of quantitative data collection. And so the alternate of, you know, what the kind of work that women's rights organizations do, looking at the you know, qualitative aspects of it, is, you know, is complementary to what the state, you know, the quantitative, because I think especially in the area of the kind of work that, you know, when you're addressing violence against women, for instance, you're addressing some challenges within women's rights. If you're looking strictly at numbers, you will not get the true picture. You need to look at the women's lived experiences. That is what will, you know, really make you understand what the problem is. And of course, holding our states accountable. I think there are various areas at the national level, but increasingly for us, and especially at the human rights, you know, level, using international human rights mechanisms is another way of holding our states accountable. Having served on the CEDAW committee for 2 terms, I can assure you that increasingly African women and Asian women are using that process of their country's reporting to hold their states to account. And so the shadow reports that they write and submit when their state is reporting, and CEDAW committee members rely on this alternate source of information, because states are always too willing to paint a very rosy picture. So it's only the kinds of reports that we receive from civil society organizations that influences the way members will address questions to the state. And no state wants to look bad at the international level, so they would go back and try and change or work on the recommendations that has been made. So increasingly using that, the human rights mechanism is an effective way of holding our states to account.
Thank you.
Do you want to respond? Talvez coisa, vamos falar no tempo que tem estado como parceiro.
So she understands that we should consider the government as our partner.
E, por exemplo, quem é colega acaba de falar de está estudando só, ele está produzindo informação quantitativa. E aquela experiência de que o Sistema Nacional de Cuidados é processo que começa com o Instituto Nacional de Estatística, que
So for example, our national caring system was a study that was conducted by the National Institute for Statistics,
é estatal,
which is the it's a governmental institution.
Mas nós desde o início não acompanha aquele processo desde 2012.
But they follow the process of the study from 2002.
Por isso não consigo fazer aquela leitura, aquela parte qualitativa que dá origem à proposta de Sistema Nacional de Cuidados.
So the government did the quantitative study, but
Quantitative.
her center did. But they did the qualitative study so that they can analyze the data.
E com aquilo que dá base no Sistema Nacional de Cuidados. Então, o Estado é sempre parceiro. Gosta de nos devolver-se, não é? De nos devolver-se. E eles gostam que também toma aquela medida, não é? Gostam eles que só também assumir.
So they have done all the analysis, and they have given the government the analysis, and the government has decided to take actions.
And I'll just add one last thing. It's important to have higher education in a good place to make sure that people are not only learning to analyze data qualitatively and quantitatively, but so that also, particularly in this case, that the perspectives that come from feminism, womanism, gender studies, etc., also can inform the research. So higher ed plays a key role. Other questions, comments?
My name is John Harris. I'm with the University of Oklahoma, and we've recently started a new initiative. We're working in northern Uganda with small-scale grassroots organizations of women who are building peace in their communities. And so my question is related to the first, which is the initiatives that we're beginning are community embedded research or even action research. In terms of how those results are produced and whether it's for use for the government, what are your experiences with how they're seen as legitimate, right? Whether or not, as opposed to a much more, traditional quantitative survey or something like that. Also, if you have any experiences working very low at the grassroots, I'd love to hear input from the panel.
Okay. Well, depends. I mean, if you're working in a small community and you collect data action research, if you label it as national level research, you're bound to run into difficulties, because especially when you have, different contexts, even within the same country, the context is different because, we have different ethnic groups, whether, it could be if you're working in a rural area, the context is totally different from what you find in an urbanized setting or even in a very urban setting. So once you say that this is something that I found within this, then it will be considered, it will be acceptable. But once you want to say that this is, because you found it here, it means it's national, then that is where the challenge is. And I think that sometimes people tend to make that mistake. If you have not done a national level study, don't call it, say a study in Uganda when you've only worked in a small community. I think that for me, that's how you have to look at it. But working with, I think that for me, working in the communities, in rural areas, in smaller communities, is where you actually are able to find what the problems are. Because in the rural communities, they still, yes, it's, they would have the cell phones and so on, but it's still a society that is still culturally embedded in, in their traditions and anything. They're still behaving like their parents 150 years ago. Patriarchy is still very strong. So these are issues that, makes the difference. As somebody who is living in, who comes from a rural community, and all of us, most people in Africa, have a rural background. They live in rural, urbanized communities, educated and so on. But you'll be surprised how much some of our, actions are influenced by our culture. And so I think that this is how you should, but it's important for you because for those of you who know Ghana, we have 2 systems of marriages. Okay, if you take it's 3. There's the customary system, which is potentially polygamous, and then there's the monogamous, which is under the law. Most Ghanaian marriages first go through the customary marriage and then convert to the ordinance marriage, that is law, under the law. And why is that so? Because we are Ghanaians, so irrespective of who you are, it doesn't matter how highly educated you are, you have to do it. I mean, nobody, under the law, it's not a requirement if you want to marry, but that's how we are. It doesn't matter. So we'll still do the customary marriage and then do the ordinance marriage. And these days we're finding that the customary marriage is even more expensive than the ordinance marriage. But this is who we are. Custom still and culture still plays a key role in our lives, irrespective of who we are.
All right, we have actually come to the end of our allotted time in this room. Who had a question?
She did. Oh, okay.
She will still have a chance to ask. But just in the I don't know if anyone's coming in after us, but we've come to the end of our time. So let me just thank everyone for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I hope you're motivated to go out and make some change. And thank you so very much for being here. If anyone wants cards or anything, we have them. So thank you.